Alright, we're about to get knee-deep into the 31 days of Horrorween, Halloween, horror, whatever terrifying H word you want to use for the autumnal season. And, I've been meaning to kind of do this video for a while. Even though horror is far and away my favorite genre, and I said horror, not anything that sounds like horror, if you get my drift. Even though it is my favorite genre, I actually have a really difficult time actually describing what makes a horror film specifically a horror film. And I think out of all the genres, the horror film is probably the most difficult to define. On the surface, it seems like the parameters would be very, very easy to figure out. But really, when you look at the overlap, the big thematic features of your standard horror film, they're actually shared by a lot of other different genres. And, when you ask most people what makes a horror film, they come out and say something like, well, it usually involves, the supernatural, and it's really bloody, and it's got violence, and the entire thing revolves around one's fear of death, and there's a lot of unknown stuff, and it scares you. And, all those qualifiers are very good, but at the same time, even if you put all of them, as a four-tiered collective, you still realize that that's not exactly attributes that are specific to the horror genre. Because, there are a lot of movies out there that are indeed scary that really no one would consider a traditional horror film. Good example, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The scene on the boat is probably one of the most terrifying sequences ever, put in a motion picture. But is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory a horror film in the same category as, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer or Cannibal Holocaust? Don't think that's the case. And once again, just because a film is, visually intense, that it has violence and blood and guts and all that fun stuff, doesn't necessarily make it a tried and true horror film. Just looking at all the action movies coming out of the years, every Quentin Tarantino movie is, traditionally, bloodier and more violent than any of the Friday the 13th films, but no one considers, Reservoir Dogs or Django Unchained to be a horror film. And even moving on to the supernatural, tons and tons of movies, focus on the otherworldly and, the supernatural and beyond the grave and all sorts of other stuff. Any number of Harry Potter movies, The Wizard of Oz, all have that supernatural thematic. But you really wouldn't call those horror films in the traditional sense either. And, even going back to the fear of death, the whole mortality thing, pretty much every movie in some way, shape, or form confronts our own mortality, right? Every film comments on our weakness and our vulnerability and the fact that we can be put in, jeopardizing situations. And frankly, it's not that difficult to kill a human being. There's so many things that give us cancer. We can get shot, walking down the street, get attacked by a dog, plane crash, car crash. All these things can happen. And so many movies, are focused on these specific fears. Something like, even The Theory of Everything. That's capitalizing on our own mortality. So even though we have these specific elements of a film, once again, I wouldn't really feel comfortable saying that these features, these attributes alone make a horror film. Which is why over the years I've decided to kind of refine and retweak my own definition of what constitutes a horror film. And mine, it has a lot of points, there's a couple of tiers to it, but I think overall it's a pretty easy way to kind of map things out. Okay, so what makes a horror film a horror film? Okay, the first step is that it's a film that has to make some sort of commentary or statement about our own mortality. That's the tier one. It has to kind of emphasize the fact that we are mortal, that we can't be killed, that we're not invincible, that a lot of times we're very, very vulnerable. The second tier is it has to focus on a specific fear that we have, a specific thing that might kill us, or a specific thing that might make us powerless, or a specific thing or concept or idea or element that makes us vulnerable, that can incapacitate us. And thirdly, it has to be a prolonged and sustained sense of dread about this particular fear. Because, like I said, looking like Willy Wonka, I mean, it's a really terrifying scene, but it only goes on for like 5 minutes. The rest of the movie's pretty, cheery and chippy and upbeat. So for it to be a traditional horror film, I think it has to actually have that prolonged emphasis where the entire film kind of lingers on it, where it's not just a passing element. It doesn't pop up at the end. It's something that just kind of goes along the entire spectrum. And I think when you put all these three elements together, you kind of have a better definition of what makes a horror film a horror film. And, me personally, I've always kind of been one of those guys that likes to kind of expand the typical definition. I mean, if you look at something like, Nightmare on Elm Street or Child's Play or The Exorcist, yeah, it's obvious that they're horror films. But using, that three-tiered formula, I mean, you look at a lot of other films out there, pretty much every war movie, I think, could be rightly considered a horror film. Something like RoboCop, when you're looking at your fear of, losing your identity and technology taking over you and having the memories of your life and your family, taken from you. I mean, that's a pretty hardcore fear. I mean, that's kind of terrifying. A movie like Aliens, which kind of comes out as more of a sci-fi action film, clearly a film that has all three elements, emphasizing vulnerability and, looking at that specific fear and having that prolonged sense of dread or focus or concentration on a vulnerability. And I think once you kind of use that framework, it's a whole lot easier to kind of accept films and judge them and categorize them as particular horror entries. So, looking at that, I mean, it really kind of broadens the horizon. I think that's the best way to look at it, because you can include so many more films in the oeuvre. I mean, obviously, you're not going to put in, stuff like, I don't know, what's a movie I saw recently? Blue Collar. I mean, this movie about losing your job, but really not a mortal fear. That's just kind of more of a social apprehension. So you got to have that dynamic where you actually feel like you're going to die at some point, or you're going to be dismembered, or something. There's some incredible existential dilemma or crisis going on. And going back to it, I think that's what makes the horror film my favorite genre. Because, much more than any other genre, I think the horror film is a commentary on our times. Because you really don't know a society and a point in time and a culture, and even, the humanity from a particular era until you know what terrifies them. What gives them, worries? What strikes them? What do they have concerns about? What's that thing that keeps them up at night? Well, the horror film, going back to the 1910s all over 2014, we're seeing these things. We're seeing this commentary on the things that, make us feel, unsure and uncertain about our own humanity. And I mean, that's going back all the way to Nosferatu and worries about, World War II and the post-World War I reconstruction, all the way up to something like, The Babadook, which is a film very much in the modern era about our fear of being a single mom and being able to raise a child and, dealing with a kid with, some severe mental disorders and not feeling as if you have the resources there to actually, be a good, parent. So we're covering all these fears, and there's such a wide spectrum, and we get this commentary, and you have free reign to actually go in there and explore these things in a way that's a whole lot more confrontational and visceral than I think you'll get in, more quote-unquote serious forms of film. So that's, in a nutshell, why I enjoy horror film, because of the sociological and psychological, and a lot of times even the philosophical overtones therein. So that's pretty much my attempt to pass the slabs test and make this pseudo-intellectual. And from here on out, we've got 31 movies to go down. Things start October 1st, runs all the way to October 31st. We're going from 1922 all the way to 2014. Every conceivable subgenre you can think of is going to be included. It's going to be a wild and woolly time. So stick around. 31 days of horror, and Halloween is coming up. And folks, if you really want to enjoy the horror film, expand your definitions, look outside traditional offerings, and you'll realize there's much more to these movies than meat and blood.